while. Erin has kicked my butt on several storytelling stages and
And
several.
vice versa.
Well, you beat me first before I ever beat you. So Erin, why don't you tell everybody just a little bit about yourself, how you got into storytelling, and about what you're doing these days in storytelling.
Yeah, I got into storytelling a few years after I moved to New York City, which I think is about 10 to 15 years ago now. I found it was a really powerful way to be able to kind of explain myself to an audience, to feel like I could put myself out there, and was really the beginnings of me starting to build a social network here in New York. I'm now artistic director of an organization called the Story Collider, which specializes in storytelling about science. So we share stories about science through our podcast and our live events with the goal of humanizing science for different audiences. And we work with scientists and engineers and technologists on how to tell stories about their lives and work.
And I know from experience, I know Erin and I work with a lot of storytellers. I work in the corporate world and with priests and ministers and rabbis and Santa Clauses and everyone in between. But I happen to know that Erin has taken the most difficult people to work with, which are scientists and engineers. They they are not naturally inclined to tell stories about their research. They like to fill PowerPoint slides with lots of graphs and let that do the talking for them. So I know she's really chosen a difficult road. So it's admirable. She has a lot of skills when it comes to working with storytellers, and she's worked with me as well. She's helped craft my stories for her stage. So she's fantastic and a treasure to have here today. Jackie, how about you? Tell us about your journey.
Well, what's interesting is I don't have a stage I've spoken on, but I've done workshops and things like that. But I'd like to go back really to my first interest in stories. And that was when I was very young. I always wanted to be read stories. So I just wanted to take them in and experience them and live them. And then when I was very little, we used to always go to a beach in Wales, and I adored the sea. And we used to spend all day on the beach because there was no phones, no technology. There was the sea, the sand, the sun, and we absolutely loved it. And then every time we had to go home, there's a really steep hill back up from the beach. And we would not want to leave the beach. And I certainly didn't want to have to go up that steep hill. And every time we came off that beach, my mum would dip down and hold my hand and say to me, "Would you like me to tell you a ghost story?" And in that moment, I just forgot all the tiredness and all the reluctance to go up the hill. And I was totally lost in the scary details of a ghost story. And we would go up this steep hill. And I always remember we'd get to the top of the hill and we'd be saying, "What happened next? What happened next?" And we were just oblivious of all the difficulties we'd had to face. And I noticed that in my whole life, really, when I allow myself to get engaged in stories, all the things that I don't want to face get to fall away. So I think it's a really therapeutic exercise, and I use it in my therapy work. I work as a coach and a therapist now, and I find that the way people can tell their lives in terms of stories, it takes them one step away from being too close to the truth of it. It gives them a much broader perspective, and then enables them to drill down into an inner wisdom, which isn't always available immediately when you're very focused on your own mind. So I love stories, I love hearing them, and I love telling them.
I love that. I like to say sometimes that when stories are told at their best, your audience forgets who they are and where they are. And I often compare the stories that we tell to the movies that we see on screens. I think we're just trying to create movies in the audience's mind. And I always think about the movie Titanic and how we all cry at the end of that movie, even though the people who are dying are in the ocean. We know they're not really in the ocean. We know that that's just Kate Winslet, and she got paid like $10 million, and she's going to be in Revolutionary Road next month. In fact, the people who actually die in that movie, most of them aren't actually historical figures. The historical figures being represented by actors who die, we just watch those people die and we don't weep at all during the movie. We only weep at the actual fictional characters who have been inserted for the sake of the story. And I just love that. I love the fact that we cry over things we know or pretend on the screen because we forget who we are and where we are. So that's great. I'm gonna ask some questions, but this is just gonna be a conversation. So any of you jump in, either one of you jump in and pursue the conversation or ask any questions. But I have a list here that I can get us started with. I guess it's not the nicest thing to say, but I always like to start with the mistakes. You know, my wife often criticizes me because when I'm working with a storyteller, I'm more likely to tell the person what they've done wrong rather than lead with the positive. And I'm an elementary school teacher, so I don't know why I do that. Uh, Well, I'd like to start there. I'd love to hear what you see as some of the, or what you hear as some of the most common mistakes that the storytellers who you work with and the stories that you hear. What are some of those? So why don't we start with you, Erin, and we'll just have a conversation about that to start.
Sure. I think the biggest mistake I see people make probably is not dwelling in scenes in their story, telling their story all in overview, jumping too quickly out of tension to resolve it. For example, we had a paleontologist tell a story with us once, and his story was about being frustrated out in the field and eventually discovering some dinosaur eggs and some great research coming out of it. And his first draft, that was exactly how he told the story. We were frustrated, but then everything worked out. We found these dinosaur eggs. But we were like, can you slow it down? Can you take us with you on this journey? And so it became this more drawn out story where he took us through this experience of discovering these eggs one by one. And then when you can hear him tell the final version, you can hear the audience react along with him. You can hear them gasp, you can hear them laugh at various points, and you can tell that they're transported into that story in exactly the ways that you and Jackie have described. And that's much more powerful when you can take someone with you as opposed to just giving them a synopsis.
Yeah, I like to sometimes tell storytellers that when you are surprised, the audience should be surprised. When you were sad, the audience should feel sad. You should take us through an emotional journey. It's not just what you saw and what you experienced. That's actually what you felt that is really the most important. And that was such a classic Erin beginning of a sentence. So I was working with a paleontologist once. Jackie, how about
In
you?
life.
I think one of the things that comes to mind is that sometimes people don't create enough intrigue up front. So it starts off bland and it gets blander. And there's no sort of feeling of being drawn into like, what's going to happen? Is there any element of suspense here? And I think sometimes if there's no intrigue and then the details just seem to go on and there was this and there was this and there was this, then I think people either fall away or they lose interest or they stop listening. And what could have been a really good story had it been crafted like you described, Matt, it's just too bland. And I think sometimes when people are telling stories about themselves, they just put too much detail in. So they want you to know what this happening and that was happening. And actually, you just want to know those pertinent facts, the ones that actually relate to the point of the story, rather than all of the extraneous details that are really important to them and mean something to them, but actually don't continue the theme or the through line to the story. So not enough mystery, not enough intrigue, and then just too much of a narrative that isn't enough, isn't linked enough to the end goal.
Yeah, I think I would have said the same two things, Jackie. I know that I'm a novelist as well, and the first novel I ever wrote, I remember my agent told me, "You wrote this novel as if it was 1730 and there was one book arriving by ship and they had only one book to read for the next 2 months." She said, "You have to grab people a lot quicker because there's a lot of options in this world." And I agree that if you don't grab people's attention right away, not only will they sort of like leave, perhaps, depending on the situation, but they'll just leave you mentally. They'll just start going through their grocery list or what they have to do later. They'll start looking around the room. So I agree completely. And I love what the other thing you said was, which is too many details. People often tell me that my stories are so vivid and they ask me how I create such vivid images in people's minds. And I always say I try to avoid all adjectives whenever possible. And I lean into nouns, like good, hard nouns that come accompanied with adjectives already. So when I say something like I'm standing in the kitchen, right? If I say I'm standing in a kitchen and I drop the bowl of strawberries on the floor, and that's all I tell you, you chose what the bowl was made of. Like I just put a picture in your mind, and it might have been a wooden bowl or a glass bowl, but if it's not relative to my story, I don't need to tell you what bowl it was, because the power of your imagination, your ability to imagine a bowl is much more powerful than me describing a bowl. And you actually imagined the floor. You decided whether it was linoleum or tile or wood. You pictured the whole kitchen. You can probably tell me if the trash is underneath the sink, the weirdos that put their trash underneath the sink, or the trash is out from the sink. You can tell me a million things about the kitchen just by the word kitchen. And that's just so much more effective than giving me the description of your kitchen, which will probably kill the story, which would, be a painful thing for all of us to have to listen to. So I agree with you. I love that. Too many details can really, it can kill a story, and kill a marriage actually, because I work with a lot of do you ever have, well, you don't have this probably, Erin, or you, Jackie, but I have a lot of people come to my workshops and I'll say, why are you in my workshop? And they say, I don't know. My wife told me I needed to come. And I always think, oh, I know why you're here. How about personally? Like, I know that personally, my sort of biggest flaw, the thing that I will most likely make a mistake on in my stories is I become obsessed with sort of minutia. Like, I'll be telling a story and I will come to something like, oh gosh, like headphones. I might mention headphones. And then I might think to myself, oh, I can make everyone laugh for 30 seconds on this little bit I have on headphones. And I'm likely to jam that into the story until my wife says, that bit on the headphones is really funny, but it doesn't really help the story and you're killing your story, so take it out. And so I am most likely to sort of wander around amusing bits and not propel my story forward in an attempt to be amusing rather than serving the story. That's sort of like one of my internal flaws. I'm wondering, do you have things that you know you do wrong that you have to be especially wary of?
I think the one you just named is probably one of mine.
Well, I'm not
Yeah, that's
surprised.
tough.
You're a very funny person.
When you got some good jokes, you want to use all of them, but sometimes less is more, I think. I think another thing that I used to do is jump out of my perspective in the story. For example, if in the story I'm younger, I don't know everything that I know now, jumping out of that perspective to let you know that everything's going to be okay. It's, I mean, I think a very human tendency because you want to resolve that tension. You want to let people know that you're not as stupid as you were at the time of the story. But it's what really takes the audience on a journey to let them see you evolve from that place in the story to where you are now.
Yeah, that's great. Jackie, how about you?
Similar to you, Matt, in that I've been known by my friends to have tangents that I go down a bit like a rabbit hole, and then I take them with me. And if I'm good at telling the story, they will remember that I had a point I left, and they will remember to come back to the point. If I'm not good at telling the story, they will disappear down the rabbit hole with me, and then they'll never remember that I was actually telling another story initially. So that's one of the things. The other thing that comes to mind is, I hope I don't do it as much now, but I have been prone to do it, and that's exaggerate. To sort of over embellish a story and to make it a little bit larger than life. I think in an attempt to impress or entertain people sometimes. And you have to be really careful if you're with people who are actually there at the time and you've over embellished it a bit and they say, actually, there wasn't that many people there, or they didn't laugh as hard as you're saying they laughed. And you just say, oh, there goes my story. So just noticing those things.
My wife, I've never added anything into a story or exaggerate, but I think it's because I'm a novelist. So when I'm writing novels, everything is made up. I have the freedom to invent everything. The thing I love about storytelling is I'm saddled with this pile of facts that I can't avoid and I can't alter. I can remove facts that are not convenient to me. I believe in like eliminating a human being from a story if they're not very helpful, if they're just not doing anything, why would they be there? But I've never actually put anything into a story because I love that puzzle nature to it. But there is the disagreement that I sometimes have where I'll tell a story and I will remember it genuinely one way, and my wife will hear me tell it and she will say, you screwed that story up completely. But I do know that there's a lot of science in terms of none of us really remember our past in the way we wish we remembered our past. So I always say it's as we remember it is the best we can do. I'm glad to hear that your problems are the same as mine. It makes me feel a little less silly. I often tell Jackie when those meanderers, I'll often tell them, congratulations, you have two stories. Like that meander often is a story, but it's not this story. If you're familiar with the NFL, which I'm sure both of you are, in football, they say if you have two quarterbacks, you don't have a quarterback. You can only have one. And I always tell people that applies to storytelling too. You can only say one thing in a story. You can only sort of be aiming to one finishing place and one final resting place, some sentiment, some change. And if you end up with two, you kind of don't have anything because people wonder what you were really trying to say. So having two stories, there's nothing wrong with that, I think.
No. There's one thing else that's just come to my mind that I think I do, that I've learnt a different angle on maybe, and that's I've been a great recounter of other people's stories. So when I listen to a lot of radio, I read a lot of stories, and I'm very moved by people's real live accounts of things that have happened. And I think I've told a lot of other people's stories, and obviously that's theirs to tell, but if it's a different scenario and they're not known to the people I'm talking to, I recount them, and I think they're still very powerful stories. But reading some of the information that you've been putting out and the book that you've written, which I've read, which is fantastic,
Oh, thank you.
the focus is really on your own personal stuff, because that's what comes as being real. And that's really shown me a big change in that I can tell other people's stories and they're not really mine to tell. So I can share them. But if I'm really telling a story, it's got to be from my own life, my own experience. And it's such a different experience to do that.
Yeah, well, if you're not telling your story, I think the thing that is missing most is vulnerability. You know, I
Mm,
can tell you the story of my grandmother, and there's no vulnerability, there's no risk to me in
mm,
sharing my grandmother's story, but there is risk to me. There's vulnerability in me talking about things that, most people would not speak of, or something that you don't know about me that I'm going to share. And I think that is critical. I work with the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And ultimately, what I'm doing is I'm teaching them to tell the story of their relatives' experience through the Holocaust. But what we do is we link those stories to their own personal stories. So they're really telling us a story about themselves. And at some point in their story, they will dip into the past to connect their life to the past experience of their grandparent or their great grandparent or their parent. And but that way they're still being vulnerable. They're not just telling a history lesson about someone who experienced something long ago, but how that experience now informs them. And those stories tend to oddly be entertaining. They're hard to hear quite often, but that doesn't mean a story is not entertaining simply because it's not easy to listen to. So yeah, I agree with you. How do you find your stories, Erin? How do you come up with? I know you don't tell as many stories on stages these days as you used to, but I know you still do. How do you find your stories?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it usually starts with something I think is funny that happened to me or that I did, and reflecting on that until it expands and becomes a story. I think also finding something funny is a good sign that I'm in a good place to be able to work on it as a story.
Mm.
I've moved on, I'm over it emotionally, and I'm at the point where I can laugh about it.
Yeah, I think probably when you're finding those funny things too, there's probably some vulnerability in there. You're probably,
Yeah,
looking at your own
I'm usually
flaws.
the thing that is funny. Yeah.
Right. Yes. How about you, Jackie? How do you find your stories?
I think my stories are all about people, the people in my life and my family. My stepfather had Alzheimer's for 15 years, and my mother now has dementia. And a day in the life of me with my mother is completely full of stories, and more than I could ever write down or retell. So I tend to draw them from all the daily situations that I'm coming across and or previous experiences. And they're often just tiny moments of usually something that's moved me, that's had an impact on me. And it hasn't got to be huge. It might have just been a moment or a glance or a shared experience or something like that. And I find the clients that come to see me when I'm coaching, they have those moments too. And some of them have been blocked if they're traumatic, and some of them float to the surface when they're least expecting them. So I think the emotional part to me is one of the most key.
Yeah, I love those small stories. I'm sort of obsessed with them. I'm a person who has unfortunately had a bunch of big stories happen to him, but I flock to the smaller stories. I'm just sort of really obsessed with the idea that our lives are filled with stories if we start to look for them. And I think those are the more relatable stories. If I tell you the story about the time I went through a windshield at 17 and died on the side of the road, like, we don't get to connect on a going through the windshield, heart stopped beating level, right? Nobody's thinking, yeah, I know what that was like. But if I tell you something little, I just think it's more likely that you're going to connect with that moment and be a little closer to me and find a little bit more to relate to. I love that. I love those little stories. I think they're everywhere, and I think we have to pay attention to find them. I have some questions in the chat, so why don't I go off my page and start looking at some of them, because they're good questions. The first one says, I always have feedback. I always have feedback about the ending tying back to the beginning. And this person asking it says they have a hard time with that. Advice on that, tying beginnings and endings together?
This is a struggle that a lot of people have. I think this is very common. And what I usually tell people is look back at the beginning. How is the ending image contrasting with the image at the beginning? How are you different here at the end from how you were at the start? And usually at the beginning of a story, you're posing a question of some kind. And at the end, you want to answer that question that you posed at the beginning.
And I know I like to start at the ending. I'm looking for a moment to speak about, and that moment is always going to be the ending, because I think it's the most important thing you say is, here's the moment I realized something, or here's the moment I did the stupid thing that informed me for the future. So if I start at the ending and I say, well, here's the way I changed, I always just say, ask yourself what the opposite of that is. And that's going to be your beginning. You know, the best example I always think of that I use is the movie When Harry Met Sally, right? At the beginning of that movie, Harry and Sally tell each other that they hate each other. And we all know they're going to love each other at the end, right? But that's essentially what stories are, is whatever is happening at the beginning will tell you what the ending is going to be. We're not creating fiction. So I like to start at the end because I like to start with the thing that I found that I want to say and then flip it to the beginning. Jackie, you have anything you want to add on that one?
I was just going to say, sometimes stories are a bit like treasure hunts for me, and it's like dropping in little clues, little details that people aren't necessarily aware of, and then they realize at the end. So if anybody here is a big Harry Potter fan, if you read the Harry Potter books, then there's clues all the way through those stories. And then when these events happen, you think, oh, and now I can see why that was there. So it's quite subtle. But I think for me, certainly, I have to have the ending in mind. Otherwise, the story doesn't end. Because I sometimes find that it could just become longer and longer. And actually, with the end in mind, it feels more contained and a bit neater. And it takes a lot more thought to create, I think, if you start with the end.
Yeah.
Rather
I
than
have a
having an
father-in-law.
open ending. Yeah, and it's just unstructured.
I have a father-in-law like that. He's telling me a story right now, and he's 90 miles, north of me, but he just never ends. I just have to walk away eventually. So it's very sad for him. But he always has something to say. How about this one? What propels a story forward? What gives stories that momentum?
I think at the start of every story, you want to create a question in your audience's minds, and you want it to be a single question. Like Matt said, you don't want to try to bring too many threads into your story, but you want to open up a question. Like in Harry Potter, for example, what will happen to this young orphan boy now that he's discovered he's a wizard? That's
Yeah.
a question that they're going to answer by the end of that.
Yep.
Mm.
Jackie?
I think sometimes seeing it a bit like a scene. So your different scenes, like a play almost, and one scene will lead to another scene. So it almost needs to be like a page turner. If you had an exciting novel to read, you'd want to know what was going to happen next. It's almost like leaving somebody on that cliff edge and then, oh, what's going to happen next? And so rather than have it just drop away and people lose interest, they've got something just to carry it over, and like, oh, that's interesting, almost like keeping that element of interest going.
Yeah, I call it wonder. I always say I want to create a sense of wonder in my audience at all times. I'm sort of really aggressive on it. I think if they're not wondering about something, the story is dead. There's no reason to listen to it if there's nothing to wonder about. Twice in my life, I've gone to the movies when the power went out. And the first time the power, they say you can come back tomorrow. The first time the power went out, I didn't go back to the movie because I didn't care if the characters lived or died because there was nothing to wonder about. But the second time, I had to get back the next day because I was trapped in this sense of wonder, wanting to know what was going to happen next. So when I'm working on stories, I always say to myself, what is my audience wondering about now? What is my audience wondering about now? You can also use humor as a replacement for wonder for a short period of time. You can like get away with being funny for a while and people will forget there's really nothing going on in your story. Like there's nothing to want to get to the next scene. Laughter will carry you for a little while, but I'm always thinking that. The worst thing is I'll listen to a podcast. I'll listen to stories in podcast form. And if I stop wondering, I just stop listening to the story. And even like my friend can be telling a story on the podcast. And if I stop wondering, I go, too many stories in my life. I got to get to another one that I'm actually like wondering what's going to happen next. I'm a jerk that way, but I do think that's what propels a story forward is the audience wondering what is going to happen next, whatever that is going to be. I like it. It's like a cliffhanger, like you said, Jackie. We're going to hang our people off a cliff all the time so that they want to know what's going to happen next. The next one says, how do you create intrigue at the start? As Jackie mentioned, I think we kind of answered that and sort of like posing that question. Is there anything else you want to add to that? The beginning of a story?
I suppose because I mentioned it, when I'm telling stories, I quite often start with setting a scene and I don't give them too much information. So describing someone in a situation, describing what they can see, the smell and hear and feel, and you don't know where they are, you don't know what's going to happen next, rather than telling them it all in one go so that there's no intrigue at all. So when I tell the story about me on the beach, you don't know at what stage I'm going to have to go up the hill or what's going to get me up the hill, and that sort of thing. You just see a picture of a child on a beach. So just giving them a very small scene, almost like a cameo, and not giving away too many clues, it just creates what you've just said, the I wonder what's going to happen next. And sometimes it can be dramatic, but sometimes I think it's quite subtle.
Yeah. Sometimes I think in a story, oftentimes there are lots of stakes that we can play with. So we can sort of like, as we move through the story, new problems arise and new situations take place. And what I tell people is, no, go away, my son. He's 8, but he's impossible. Okay, go ahead to the park. Sorry. What I tell storytellers is get that pile of stakes, figure out what they are, and then plant them throughout your story. Because I think so often people want to throw everything right at the top, afraid that people are going to not listen to them unless they give, everything in the kitchen sink right up top. And I just think it's a much more interesting story if, in minute 3, we discover a new thing that's creating a problem for our storyteller that could have been told at the beginning, but has been saved until this moment when things started to get a little down. I also am a big believer in starting a story with some motion, with things happening. I think so often people start stories with exposition. They'll say things like, a storyteller just started a story like this with me recently. She said, let me tell you a little bit about my hometown. It was a one light town, in a little suburb in Rhode Island. And I said, no. I said, I don't even want to listen to it. You're just giving me the description of a town. Like I'll take that later, but can something happen? Can something actually happen in the first sentence or two of your story instead of, because I think people feel like I need to give you the lay of the land before anything happens. Right. But that's not how movies work. Movies are never like, let me tell you all about the town that this story is going to take place in before I start. It doesn't work that way. So I think that's a good way to sort of create some of that intrigue at the beginning of a story by actually starting the story in a way that gets people excited.
Yeah, Elmore Leonard said never start with the weather, right? Because people are always looking for a character to connect with at the start of a story.
Yeah. Although it worked in A Wrinkle in Time. It was a dark and stormy night is the first sentence of that book. And I always tell my students, they're 10, I say, that's the only book that gets to start like that. She did it and she's done it. And now you need to find something more interesting. I love paying attention to the first sort of 5 minutes of a movie. I learned so much by watching movies. I think actually I started becoming a storyteller when I was 10 and I became obsessed with movies. I wrote to Steven Spielberg telling him how he screwed up E.T. and how I would help him with all his future movies if he would just send me the original cut. He never responded, Shock. I've become convinced I don't think my mother sent the letter. Because how do you find Steven Spielberg in 1983 without the internet? But I'm obsessed with the idea of pay attention to the first 5 minutes of a movie, right? The first 5 minutes of a movie is never exposition. It's never, let me tell you how MI6 works before Tom Cruise is going to do something cool in Mission Impossible, right? It opens with he's hanging off a plane and we're not quite sure why, but we're all in right now. We'll learn the nature of why he's off the plane later on. We've started the story with something that grabs our attention. So I'm a big believer in paying attention to the first 5 minutes of a movie and stealing everything that those directors and cinematographers are doing to enhance your stories too. All right, let me go back to the chat and just grab another question. My father-in-law is not listening to this, I guarantee you. Thank you for, there was concern. He knows though, I've told him. I've said, I'm leaving, Jerry. You can keep talking, but I'm out of here right now. How about this one? It says, how and where do you implement a wow factor? Any tips for creating a wow factor in a story?
We talking about creating a big moment in a story?
You can make it whenever you want, Erin, because everything you say is just full of wisdom. So,
well, thank you. I think you need to, when you're working on your story, pay attention to the most important scenes. Usually there's one scene where the change in your story really takes place, and you want to make sure you spend a lot of time in that scene. You might want to slow down your pace so that the audience recognizes that this is important. You might want to change your tone so that you feel very present in that moment. You might want to use a little bit more detail that you use in other places in the story. All of that will help direct the audience's attention and let them know this is a big moment.
yeah, that's great. Jackie, anything to add for wow factors?
Can't really add to that except the use of a pause and the use of silence and just the stillness to allow something to settle. Because I notice, and you're talking about films, and in all the films I've watched that have made me jump, just before they make me jump, they make me feel really relaxed. Everything's going to be fine. It's all going to be great. And oh no, it jumps out of the cupboard and frightens us all to death. So it's almost like the opposite of, instead of building up, this is going to be a wow moment, just like we're going to take you very far away from the wow moment, but here it is. So it becomes a surprise. In my own work, with my therapy work, when I use my color bottles to help people get clear on what they're experiencing, that's often a wow moment for them. And it's not something I've created, but they'll be in the middle of a story, their own story, and then they have a realization of a truth that they weren't aware of previous to that. And what I love is it becomes a wow that I haven't created. And that would be that becomes a wow in their own life then. So it's their own life story wow, really.
Yeah. My son is only 8. I mean, he was the one who just bothered us. And he knows a lot about film now because we watch it together so often. And he'll turn to me and he'll go, uh-oh, everything seems pretty good right now. And I say, yep, you're right. We also have these moments where he'll turn to me and go, we're in the pit of despair, aren't we? Which is the moment 3/4 of the way through a movie when everything is lost. He'll turn to me, it's the pit of despair. Everything will turn around now. He knows, like, that's just, but it's the way stories work. I always think the wow factor, the thing that I get obsessed about is surprise in a story. I think it's the most delightful thing you can offer an audience, is a genuine surprise. And I think always the mistake people make is, because they've already experienced the surprise, they don't recognize the opportunity to then surprise their audience as well, because it's no longer a surprise to them. So I'm always saying, like, find the moment that you're surprised, and then you have to find a way to surprise them. And oftentimes that means you need to tell them some things earlier in the story, but while telling them those things, you have to make it clear that those things are not really important, even though you know they're important. Like, kind of like what you said, Jackie, is like laying some clues along the way, but hiding them in such a way that you know they're important, but nobody else knows they're important until, boom, the surprise happens. So I think lots of opportunities for wow factors in stories, though. Whenever you are surprised, your audience should be surprised. And I think that's a beautiful thing. Someone asked, what's an example of that small town story, the one light story? How would it begin otherwise? This would be a terrible beginning, but I would start a story with something like, I'm driving down Main Street, passing by the candy store, desperate to get to the girl's house because it's our first date together. I go through the traffic light. It's the only traffic light in town. That's the kind of town I'm driving through right now. It is a one traffic light town. And at the end of this street, there is the girl that I am hoping to marry someday. You bury it in the story while things are actually happening. Does that make sense to you guys? Let's see. Oh, how about this? This is a good question, actually. It's about stand-up and about live storytelling. The rule in stand-up is sort of like, you got to get a laugh within the first 20 seconds. How do you feel about humor in storytelling?
I think, yeah, humor is huge in storytelling, both for keeping people's attention and also, I think, for creating affection for the characters in your story, including yourself as a character.
Jackie?
I think humor is a very useful release. So I think people relax and soften if they've been made to laugh. And I think they possibly trust you a bit more too. So that it creates a warmth and a connection, I think, between two people, that they've laughed together, they've shared that moment. So I think some of that guard, if there was any guard or any resistance to the story, that would release a little bit of that. And I think just people love to laugh. So I think it's really important. I think a story without any laughs in it at all would be a very dull story.
Yeah, I tell people, for me, most of my stories have elements of humor, although there are a couple that don't, genuinely. I like what you said about trust, though, Jackie. I always think that if I make people laugh, I've made an emotional connection with them. Like, I presented an idea or a view on my world that I think is amusing. And if you laugh, now we have agreed, right? It's essentially how I got my wife. My wife informed me it was not this that, caused her to look my way. It was what I said. But I do think a quick laugh in the beginning of a story creates an immediate emotional connection. It's a tenuous one. It's not terribly important, but it's a start. I also work with a lot of storytellers where if they get a laugh in the first 30 seconds of the story, boy, do they relax. Like, it is a gift to a storyteller. Oftentimes it's a gift I give, where I'll say, well, here's the joke in the first 30 seconds. They'll get you the nice big laugh and then we'll relax you. And I've watched storytellers go from like terrified little kittens to like completely relaxed and owning the stage just by that one laugh they get right off the top that makes them feel accepted by the audience. We only have a couple minutes here, but how about in the last couple minutes that we have, can you give advice on sort of like if you have someone taking a stage, let's pretend it's a live stage, it's pre-COVID or post-COVID. Actually, let's go post-COVID. Uh, and someone's going to be taking a stage and they're incredibly nervous. What kind of advice do you give your storytellers? We'll start with you, Erin. What do you tell your storytellers to be relaxed, or what do you offer to them to make it a little bit better for them?
That's a great question because I'm actually not great at giving advice on this topic. I had a lot of stage fright early on, and I think it's just one of those things you have to work out through exposure therapy. It just goes away with time. But almost everyone I work with, by the time they step off stage, is really happy that they did it, even if they don't believe me that they're going to feel that way at the start.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Jackie, how about you?
Well, I teach yoga, so I would do breathing exercises just to try and get out of your head. And you mentioned earlier the fight, flight, freeze, this silent. No, I think that was in the previous talk, but people talking about a stress reaction in the physical body. And they were talking about with the comedy slot. But when you have access to more oxygen, when the nervous system gets an opportunity just to calm down, it takes you a little bit out of your head and a bit more back into that physical part of you. So that's the first thing I would do, would be to do some exercises. And the other thing is to just remind them that the people out there are really rooting for them. So I think we sometimes think there's me and there's them, and they're expecting this and I've got to deliver that. And there's a lot of pressure that we put on ourselves, believing that they're giving us that pressure. And actually, I think a lot of people, they just want to see you do well. They just want to enjoy the story. They just want it to be a great experience. So just reminding yourself that you've sat in audiences and you've wanted the speaker to succeed, and they're doing the same for you. So just to trust that process a bit more, really.
That's great. I'll just add that two things I tell my storytellers. One is I tell them to have a recording of the story that they can listen to just prior to coming on stage. We work with long-term memory to remember our stories, but when you listen to it right before you take the stage, you can activate that short-term memory. And it's another way to listen to your story so you don't seem like the weirdo who's walking in the back talking to yourself. You can just sit, relax, breathe, and listen to your story. That can be very helpful. And then I like to remind people that time operates differently on stage, that 5 seconds to you feels like a year and it feels like nothing. So like the time it takes to adjust your microphone, put your feet where you want them, take a nice deep breath, put a good thought in your head. Nobody notices you do any of it. And it feels like forever to people. So I remind people, take your time. Time operates differently on stage, but you have to ignore that feeling and just do what you need to do to perform well. All right, I think it is time. We have hit the 3:15 mark, or 3:15 here. I think it is not 3:15 where everyone else is except for Erin and myself. But we thank you very much for joining us. I know that all three of us are reachable through some contacts that the conference has provided. So we'd be happy to hear from you if you have any questions or anything further. But for Jackie and for Erin, thank you for your time as well. Greatly appreciated.
Yeah, thank you.
Great to see you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. All right. Have a great rest of your conference, a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
What do we go back to the main
I
room?
believe you go back to the main room, but honestly, this is the extent of my knowledge of this situation. It has now come to an end. I have no more responsibility.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Hold on a
Yeah.
second. Please check in the chat. I'm going to place the link in there multiple times because people keep posting the same questions. There's the link. It's in the chat. No more questions about the link. Just click on it. You'll be good to go.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Matt. Awesome
Yep.
job. Great presentation. Well done.
All right. Take care, Erin. Take care, Jackie. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Cheers, Matt. Bye.
I'm just going to make sure everyone is carefully ensconced into the new session, back in session 1. A few people might have walked away from their desk. Awesome.